You know, pour over coffee is like 24 frames per second. After you get used to it, you can really tell the difference. I can't believe that one of my videos has over 50,000 views. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Job Crowley. I'm a cabinet installer, YouTuber, and vlogger, and I've been making for the past over a year now content about the M50 and how to get good video out of this little cinematic beast. And since I'm one of, if not the only person here on YouTube who has been making content exclusively with the M50 and almost exclusively about the M50, I've pretty much mastered this camera. And with that, I've gotten a lot of questions on the settings that I use for making videos and how I make my M50 footage look so good. Because out of the box, this camera, it looks fine, but it doesn't look great. And so you're not gonna be able to get great images without changing some settings. And so this video is gonna be about the top 7 settings that I change right out of the box in order to get better videos with the M50. Now the first thing, and this is probably the top thing that I think that you should change right out of the box on the M50, is your picture style. This is the default auto picture style, and this is what your camera's gonna be shooting right out of the box. And really, I do not like this image. I think the reds are too saturated. I think that my shadows are way too dark. The balance between the highlights and the shadows is just not very good. And when you have something like a studio setup where you want to have fall off on one side of your face, it just doesn't look good. And so the first thing that I would do is I would change this. And what I changed this to is the neutral picture profile, and then I raised the sharpness to 2, and I lowered the contrast to -4. I leave saturation and color tone at the same point. And I've talked to people in the comment section to my videos where they've said that the only thing that they've changed is the picture profile from auto to this modified neutral profile, and they said it was like a new camera and everything that they shot looked better. And so if you're shooting in auto, try shooting in the neutral profile. You can still add more contrast and saturation in post if you want to, but this is a much better starting point for color grading, and it will help balance your shadows and your highlights way better. Now there's also other profiles like CineStyle and Marvel's Advanced. I have used those on occasion, but I have always come back to the neutral profile. I even used one that you had to pay for, which was VisionTech, but I've always found that the shadows were a bit more muddy and had less detail than the modified neutral profile that I've been using for, well, longer than I had this camera, because I used it on my M1 and M3 before this. Another thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to switch your exposure mode from automatic to manual mode. Now this is really important. If you look at this setting, it looks okay. But what the camera actually did is it switched my shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, which your shutter speed should not be at that. Look at how much motion blur there is. If I was doing any movement in my shot, then this would be way too much motion blur. Then it put the ISO at 800, which it probably didn't have to go up that high. And then because that was too bright, it decided to close down my aperture to 5.6. So I'm not getting as much shallow depth of field as I could. My images aren't gonna look as natural because I don't have natural motion blur. I have too much motion blur. And it's gonna be noisier and a little softer than it needed to be because my camera decided that the ISO needs to be higher than it should. And here's the settings that I would have chosen if I was doing this setting manually. The ISO is literally in half at 400 instead of 800. My shutter speed is at 1/50th of a second, which is double my frame rate of 24 frames per second, giving me natural motion blur. So if I was like talking with my hand, which I tend to do, it wouldn't look like blurs. It would look natural, as if you were standing there talking to me. And if I had a faster lens, I could open it up wider, cut my ISO down, but there's no guarantee that the automatic mode on the camera would have allowed me to do that. And then when we go outside, you have something like this, where in order to get me exposed properly, it raised my aperture up to f8, lowered my ISO to 100, but then it put my shutter speed to 200. And now I'm getting like a super jittery motion in my shot, and I'm not getting enough motion blur. And so it sort of is the opposite problem in the opposite direction. Whereas me, for a shot like this, so that I get the proper motion blur and it doesn't look jittery, I would put it at like f16, what I have it at now. Yes, my depth of field is significantly deeper, but I would actually much rather have proper motion blur and have it look like you would see me in real life than having a deep depth of field. Now, if you don't have much motion in your shot, then it's totally fine to use a higher shutter speed. But I really like to keep my shutter speed double my frame rate because it looks the most natural. You saw it was just super sunny, and then all of a sudden, whoosh. Now keep in mind that this is not 7 ways to make it easier to shoot video on the M50. This is how to get better video on the M50. And the fact is that learning how to do your exposure manually and figuring out what the different settings do will actually help you in making your videos look better, because you will then be determining the look. But before we leave this segment about aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, let me explain a little bit about each to sort of get the basics in your head. This all will come a lot easier with time and practice and being able to see what these different settings do. And because I just answered this question in a single tweet on Twitter, I thought I would just read you what I wrote. Aperture controls depth of field. Lower number equals shallower depth of field. Shutter speed controls motion blur. Higher number equals less blur. Both of these also control exposure. ISO determines the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Higher number equals brighter but causes more noise. And if you're still confused after that, I have an entire video about aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and I'll link it above and in the description. And if you're wondering what that sound was in the background, it's my daughter's percussion vest, which is basically just to kind of get her body moving since she can't walk or anything. You can look back at my earliest videos about that. This is sort of to get her body moving and hopefully get the congestion up out of her lungs that we've been dealing with for the past 3 months. And next we're going to talk about frame rate. And before you skip over the scene saying, I already know about frame rate, listen to my reasons before you write off this section. And that's another week down. Now I had to caveat right here because most of what I'm going to say is about NTSC regions, not PAL regions. So if you're in Europe or other regions that don't use the NTSC video format, then this will not apply to you. You'll be using 25 frames per second and 50 frames per second, whereas us in NTSC regions use 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. Now I'm sure that you've heard from a lot of people that you should shoot in 24 frames per second, and that's the frame rate that I use and the frame rate that I would suggest for you to use for your live motion shots. And there's a few reasons for this. And I'm not going to go with the cliche, oh, it's more cinematic, because that's not technically true. There are movies that are shot at 48 frames per second. There are movies that are shot at 24, 30. Cinematic just technically means quality of the cinema. But the reason that I suggest for you to shoot in 24 frames per second, there's really two. It's the most natural way that your eye sees movement. And the other reason is that when you're trying to do slow motion with this camera, of course we don't have anything except 60 frames per second in 1080p. And when you use 60 frames per second, you can slow it down 10% more when your final product is in 24 frames per second than when your final product is in 30 frames per second. So in my opinion, it is always better to shoot at 24 frames per second because you can slow down your slow motion more, which gives it a smoother look, especially if you're shooting handheld. and it'll mimic the eye. Most of my filmmaking, how I talk, I'm trying to mimic the eye because I don't want it to feel like you're watching a video as much as sort of, you know, hanging out with a friend. So when I talk about something looking natural, that's what I'm talking about. It looks like how we would see it with our eyes. Another important setting to change is actually your audio recording, and you want to switch it from automatic to manual. Now I have an entire video on this about why, and the biggest reason is that when you're using automatic audio settings, when you don't have a lot of noise in your video like this, it'll actually raise your audio level. You don't want the hiss of your audio, the baseline, the ambient noise to raise up when you stop talking. You want it to stay consistent. I think we're gonna do the last few in here because the sun just went down and I don't want to do a low light video. By the way, I made notes for this video and it's been so much easier to do with notes than just trying to wing it. The next step that I would have is use manual white balance. And there are a few reasons for this, and this one is not as important as pretty much any of the others. The camera, when it's trying to decide which white balance to use, kind of gets confused a lot of the time because different scenarios require different white balances. You need a different white balance in the shade than you do in direct sunlight. Going between those two, it's going to be changing your white balance. And sometimes, depending on what you're wearing, what you're doing, if there's a neon sign behind you, it doesn't matter. It will give you a green or magenta shift and not just change how warm or cool it is. Probably 80% of the time it does it correctly, you have no problem. But that 20% of the time really bugs me, and I don't want to have to be color correcting 20% of my footage in every video. Most of the time, I don't do any color grading. Now, if you want a really quick, cool hack for nailing your white balance every time, check up at the card here or in the description. And another reason I think that this is important is that the M50 does not have a very high bitrate 1080p. It's a good quality, nice, sharp, good-looking 1080p image, but it's not a high bitrate. It does not have a lot of information. And so when you start color correcting, start tweaking, your image is going to start getting a bit mushy and less sharp pretty quickly. And so you can't do more than just minor tweaks or else you start losing quality. And that's the biggest reason that I suggest you always to use manual white balance. But again, if you know how to color correct and you're good at it, and you should just sort of check on your camera to make sure that the colors are looking pretty good, then you'll probably be fine. The next setting that I would change is your BTN or button function. It is so much easier to hit the shutter release button for your video record than it is to try and fumble around and find it. And because it's a tactile button that you feel when you press it, you know that you pressed it. Unlike the little button, which I use occasionally, but I almost always use the shutter release button. And it might seem like a little thing, but it makes a huge difference. And when I figured out after like 2 months that I was able to do that, so much nicer. I mean, that button is there because it's in the most ergonomic, comfortable place to hit a button. It's definitely worth it. And the last setting that I want you to either change or not change, I'm not sure exactly how it comes default, but one setting that you want to have activated at all times is your histogram. Now, I have not done a video on this. I am going to do an entire video on histogram and why you should be using histogram in order to check your exposure, because it makes it so much easier. But the main thing to keep in mind is that everything on your left side of your histogram is your shadows, and everything on the right side of your histogram is your highlights. Anything that touches either of those sides, you do not have information in that area. Now, this doesn't like sample across the image like, say, a waveform. And so basically what you want to do is you want to have most of your exposure values, like I have right now, you want to have most of your exposure values in the middle of the histogram. That is the area where you're still retaining information. Really, anywhere on that spectrum, if you have the highest of your peaks in that middle section, your exposure is pretty much correct. Because the screen on the M50 sometimes plays tricks on you, and you think that you're blowing out your highlights when actually they're safe, or you think you're crushing your shadows when your shadows are safe. So you cannot always trust the screen. I would say get your exposure close with the screen, check it with your histogram, and in my experience, the screen on the M50 does not display the full dynamic range that this camera can actually use. And I think that about wraps it up. That is 7 settings that immediately you don't have to pay anything for, and they will immediately improve the quality of your videos. Now, most of these, because you're using manual settings instead of auto, it is going to make your entire workflow take longer at first. But in the long run, it will make your entire workflow not only look better, but take less time. Knowing your camera, instead of just throwing it on auto, is always going to help your video. If you found this video helpful, I'd be grateful if you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, hit that notification bell so you know when I actually post videos like this. I'll see you all in the next video.